think that's working. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. This is how many we had in church this morning. Right, a little chilly, a little icy for everybody, so it's good to see you all. We got a full house here downstairs, and so it's good to be together. Good to come together as church, God's people, leaning into the Word of God and seeing a little bit, I think, of what God can teach us this morning. This Bible study continues to, I pray, be something that we can gain some leverage as far as what does it mean to be a Christian in today's world. And so as I was thinking about some of the anxiety and the fear and the turmoil that we feel is in this world, and I said, there was a couple in the Bible that I recall that found themselves in a place that wasn't God-focused in their society. And I said, Daniel and Esther were two. And so we kind of started to dive into this, and it's kind of been a real helpful, I believe, for me it has been, I hope for you in some ways, to be able to say, so how does Daniel's life and his dedication to stay true to the gospel, the gospel was still present in the Old Testament, it just wasn't professed in the same way. They trusted the presence and the promise of God, where we have the benefit and the blessing of being on this side of the resurrection. So this morning, we're going to dive into Daniel 6. This is probably, I think it's safe to say, this is the most familiar, well-known story in Daniel. Daniel and the lion's den, right? I want you to know, my kids grew up in the age of Veggie Tales. Right? Now, if you've ever seen those cartoons and think of computer animation, there is one that they did about Daniel. And while I was writing this Bible class, that was just running. My wife she can attest to it. I was finding the songs on YouTube, and I was playing. My daughter was cracking up, and I'm just kind of like, man, because we had a lot of years with Veggie Tales, right? I mean, as a dad, I'd sit and watch it. So I'm sorry, I burned some brain cells memorizing Veggie Tales songs. Not any good for you, but I've got them. They're in there, and my daughter and I were sitting in the living room, and she was singing along. I'm not going to sing, no. But I know them, boy, I tell you. That's a sad thing.
I don't believe you.
So, Daniel 6, this is what I'm going to ask you to read starting next week, or this coming week. It's on the back side of your page. So we're going to dive in and really kind of look at this and find out what can we glean, what can we take from the story of Daniel, what can we be encouraged by and maybe challenged by, all right? So I'm going to pick a bunch of words. I like alliteration. They tend to be a little bit more memorable, so we're going to use a bunch of D words, all right? So, first of all, when we start reading chapter 6, we learn of Daniel's devotion. Now, we know this already, right? We know that he was dedicated to worshiping God and nothing else, not bowing down to golden idols, not willing to compromise his own dietary restrictions as a Jew, and try to remain to eat things that are what we would say today are kosher. They wouldn't have called it that back in the Old Testament, but those restrictions that God had laid out to them for a diet. So we know this, but this is key in this particular time because it makes it such a point as we see his devotion. Because what we learn from Daniel is that prayer for him is essential. Prayer is not Christianity 2.0. It is not new and improved Christianity. It is as necessary as breathing, as necessary as eating. And so I know, guys, I have wrestled in my own Christian walk to have regular and intentional prayer. We all do. We have those times where you're kind of like, man, I'm parched spiritually. And then you kind of have that aha moment. You're like, I haven't prayed, right? Whether it's today or a couple of days, or maybe you still struggle even having a habit of prayer. My prayer time is something I do every single day. I pray in the shower, right? That's more than you want to know about your pastor, but I do because it's something I do first thing in the morning. I don't have to think a lot about what I'm doing in the shower. It's pretty kind of on autopilot. And I, not to be too personal here, I figure I'm about as exposed to God as I'm going to be all day long. So I figure that's the time to pray, and just that's what runs on my mind. And Sometimes I even run out of hot water a little bit on your case, some of you, right? You're the reason that sometimes you're like, I'm out of hot water now. You're like, because prayers kind of go on. That's not the only time I pray. That's the regular time. What I believe is that we sometimes have grown to believe that prayer is very formal when I don't believe that it should be. Right? Now, you are talking to the God of the universe. But the fact that sometimes we think, do I have to kneel down, close my eyes, fold my hands, and so forth. I can tell you, when I'm out riding on my motorcycle, going someplace, visiting someone, I often pray on the trip, right, while I'm driving along. In God's creation, it's beautiful. Now, if I got to close my eyes and fold my hands, that's going to get a little dangerous. Instead, I just lob prayers wherever I go. I drive by somebody who's walking along the road, and they just kind of look heavy. And I'm like, Lord, I don't know what they're dealing with, but I just pray your blessing upon them. Or I talk with somebody on the phone. You guys, some of you have experienced this. You'll share with me some great news or some troubling news, and a lot of times I'll just say, hey, can I pray for you right now? On the phone. It's okay, right, to do that. And we just pray. And that's the way prayer should be. It's not essential as in part of our formality as Christians, but it is just our way of connecting to God and letting Him connect to us. Because, see, prayer puts you in a certain mindset that very few other things do. And so it's just incredibly important. So I'm gonna pull this from our worship service just earlier this morning. If you're going to 10 o'clock, that's the title of our message today, No Leftovers. But one reason I'm putting that down is that a lot of times prayer becomes a leftover. Oh, I need to pray. I got to find some time for this. When I was in college, I went to Concordia College in Ann Arbor. It's now since a university in Ann Arbor, Michigan. That's where I met my beautiful bride. And in the dorms, we had these suites, 2 rooms, shared a bathroom in the middle in this little area, and there were phones in that little area. And so the 4 students that shared the suite could use that phone. It was a campus phone. You call long distance and so forth. So when I was courting my wife, right, I would sometimes call her on the phone at night, right, to say good night, to talk with her and things like that. And there were times, and this is shameful on my part, is I would sit on a chair there. It's after 10 o'clock, because 10 o'clock you had to get out of the dorm, couldn't be in dorms, somebody else's dorm at that point. And I would sit there and I'd be talking with her, and I would begin to fall asleep on the phone. Not because my wife is boring, but because I was a poor boyfriend, right? And there were times like that. I don't know if that's ever happened with you, or you're talking with somebody and you're at home and you're sitting somewhere comfortable and you're just staying on the phone because you like to talk, but you're not talking about anything really, deliberate that's one point after the other, and you kind of drift off. The reason I bring that up is sometimes if you pray at night in bed, laying down with your eyes closed, that's the same thing. I've done that, and I fall asleep on God, right? And I could just imagine Him just kind of wanting to go, right? Wake up, you're not finished, right? You're right in the middle of please help, and then I lost you, right? Drop the call, okay? Don't give Him leftovers. I get a Bible reading in the morning from a church down in Atlanta, Georgia, and they put out something that's called the First 15. And you can search it and find it. It's an email that you get, and it says the first 15 minutes of your day belongs to God. Now, all of it does, but you just dedicate the first 15 minutes. Some people kind of go, I just don't have any time in the morning. What's the solution?
Get up 15 minutes.
Get up 15 minutes earlier, right? And then, now if you're rolling your eyes at that, then we need to talk, okay? Because if God is the priority, right, then you kind of go, this is the time, right? I don't breeze through the house and not say anything to my wife, who I love. I don't just sit there and go, I don't have time to talk with you and say good morning and I love you. I haven't got time for that, right? That wouldn't probably bode real well for our relationship. She's agreeing with me, right?
Yeah.
Right? The point is, don't give God our leftovers, and neither did Daniel, right? So as you and I struggle in our world right now as Christians with restrictions and maybe even more restrictions coming, let's recognize what it is that God calls us to be is in a relationship, a prioritized relationship. Not just raise it, make it the most important. I've used this many times, is that a lot of times we kind of imagine our life or our day as being a pie, and the pie pieces are the different responsibilities we have, and we're like, love God, love spouse, love kids, love my neighbors, love my church, and we kind of cut up this pie. That's absolutely wrong, right? As soon as you make God number one in your life, you're wrong, and here's why. If God is number one, then something else apart from God is number two. And then something else apart from God is number three. And you've compartmentalized God. Even if you say God is the biggest piece of the pie, I'm telling you, God is the pie. And you cut it up from there. Okay? My love for my wife, shaped by my love for God. My love for my children has to be shaped by my love for God. My love for my church, my neighbors, and so forth. But God is the pie. Because if I love my wife apart from a love from God, that love is selfish and self-serving. If I love my kids apart from my love for God, it is not selfless, it is not sacrificial. Okay? So when we say, I want to make God number one in my life, just make God in your life. Right? Not that you get to make that, but you understand the Spirit does that. All right. So no leftovers that we recognize. All right. Let's open up Daniel 9:23. Daniel 9:23, if you're there. Obviously, we're looking at Daniel 6, but we're going to jump ahead to some dialogue here. Daniel 9:23. Somebody have it for us, please.
At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision.
So Daniel is expressing this conversation that he has had with God, right? And this plea that the king, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second, for King Darius or Cyrus and so forth. But there's this recognition that Daniel wants to communicate what God has given him. I think most of us would believe this, whether you've experienced it personally or not, that God does speak to us. Right? That God does. Sometimes he does through his word, through other people. I think sometimes he speaks and nudges right to our heart and our minds. But it is not often that he does that. He wants us to lean in and really seek him out. Not that it's difficult in a sense that he's waiting for you to really put some sweat equity in it. But if God were to answer every question you ever had, you understand the kind of questions you'd give him. Right? If you've ever had a toddler, you know what I'm talking about. Right? When they learn that word why, okay, that is incessant. Okay? And I know it's how they gain some understanding of the world around them, but if you knew that God would answer you verbally every single question, I would be asking constantly. Why did that happen? How come that is? Why is the sky blue? You know? Right? And all those kind of things. Instead, God says, listen, let's talk about some really deep things that are going to shape you and direct you. Okay? The fact that the sky is blue is not really relevant to your job. Okay? Beautiful. Thank you for that. But it's not actually critical to moving forward. And you and I have finite time, and we need to spend our time, right, focused on the things of God. Celebrate the blue sky, right? But to be able to focus on what is. So Daniel kind of helps us with that. Chapter 10, verse 11 and 19. Somebody just jump to the next chapter for me.
And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. And he said, O man greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you, be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened, and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me.
So here's God speaking to Daniel. By the way, when he says greatly loved, that's the same phrase Jesus used to John. Right? When we read the Gospel of John, and John often refers to him as the disciple whom God loved, or that Jesus loved, same words. Granted, one's Hebrew, one's Greek, but it's the same words, referring to you I love. That's why we're talking, right? That's why we're having this dialogue. Now, this is not the only time that this has happened, right? This devotion between God's people and God. Somebody look at Genesis 19:27. Genesis 19:27.
And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord.
So why is he there, do you think?
Talk to God.
Going to talk to God, right? Goes back to that same place. I want you to know the place doesn't matter to God. It sometimes matters to us. Right? There are times during the day I'll sneak into the sanctuary during the day and pray. And that's not a long distance call at that point. Okay? But neither is this place right here. Or on the seat of my motorcycle, or me sitting in my living room, or me flying in a plane, or whatever the case may be. Any place is a place to have a conversation with God. But sometimes the places help us, right? I find the sanctuary very quiet, right? Very soothing in many ways. Some of you have a place in your house where you might have morning devotion, where you read the Bible, where you have that comfortable chair in your journal and kind of have your prayer closet or whatever the case may be. Those are places you're like, this helps me focus. For me, it's usually with a fly rod and a pair of waders, right? That's where I often commune with God best. And I just appreciate that. Again, it is not that God, granted, he called a lot of fishermen, and I'm not saying that's really relevant, but that's a place where I just resonate with God, right? And it doesn't mean that if I was on a corner of a busy city street that God wouldn't hear my prayer and so forth. There are certain places where we can go. So Abraham returns back to a place. How about David? Psalm 5:3. Somebody have that.
O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch.
Interesting, David even says, in the morning. He doesn't say, oh Lord, sometime when I have some time, you hear my prayer. Lord, sometime when I'm not so busy, I can bring the sacrifice before you. He says, in the morning, priority. How about Jesus, Mark 1:35? You guys hear it today in the gospel reading, right? Jesus went away early in the morning to pray. Now, there's a whole theological discussion we can have with that, of Jesus going away in the morning and talking to himself. Because he's God, right? But he's also talking to his Father, who is that unique economy of the Trinity. But that to him was encouraging. He wasn't just doing it to set an example. If he would have been setting an example for people, he would have told everybody, I'm going to pray, everybody do this. Right? Instead, he says, I'm going away. I want to be strengthened because this walk as a human is tough. Right? One of the things we talked about in our epistle reading was that he surrendered everything, humiliated himself by becoming man. Right? Even submitted himself to death, even death on a cross. All right? So, we recognize there's other examples, lots of examples through the Bible of devotion. All right, so then we begin, as we go through the story in chapter 6, with the deception, right? The lie that is going to be perpetrated against Daniel at this point. And so let me just revisit this of where this comes from, why the deception, why are there these satraps, or what they call princes? Why are they so angry with Daniel and want to trick the king into punishing Daniel by throwing him in the lion's den? So the leadership in the land kind of goes this way. You've got King Darius. If you remember last week, we had Belshazzar, who was the king at the time after Nebuchadnezzar had died, and they'd had some transition between different kings and so forth. And Belshazzar is the one that saw the writing on the wall. Everybody remember that from last week, only 7 days ago? And that writing on the wall was God's judgment upon him. You have been weighed and measured and found wanting, and this very night your kingdom is going to be divided. And Cyrus, the Persians and the Medes, were right outside. And he was like, we're so safe inside here, we're going to have a party. And not only was the party a big party, but when they ran out of cups, they went and got the vessels from the temple from Jerusalem that they had captured, drank wine and revelry from that, and God goes, that's enough. And that's where the writing on the wall from this hand comes in, and great fear and overthrow, and the king actually is killed that very night. So King Darius steps onto the scene. There's also Cyrus in the Persian manuscripts. Some people think it's the same guy, King Darius and the king, Cyrus the king. Either way, it could be one of those situations, I think I shared it last week, could be a king and a governor. But either way, so King Darius is the one in the story right now. He's a smart politician, so he says, I want to divide the influence around there, and I'm going to tell you in a minute why. So he has under him 3 presidents, not actually those words, but the Hebrew word essentially means president, and Daniel is number 1. Right? Now Daniel is number 1, not so much because of his reputation, but because of his ability. Right? If you remember Belshazzar last time, that when they didn't know what the writing on the wall meant, because it was written in Aramaic, and Aramaic doesn't have vowels, only has consonants, and not sure what it's supposed to say, and they want to get it right. His mom, right, that used to be Nebuchadnezzar's relation, had said, you got to call this Daniel guy. We think at that point Daniel was probably retired, old man. So he's still involved, and Darius kind of doesn't give him the option of retirement, right? They're kind of like, hey, there's a new administration again, right? So you need to come in and receive this job. And I need you to do it. I need you to do it well, and so forth. So as you come in, that's going to be your job, is to be a president, oversee. But Daniel, kind of like Joseph, when he served in Egypt, he was really good at what he did, right? And so the king was smart. Put good guys in charge and put them in those places. Underneath the presidents were these 120 princes, okay? These princes, they're kind of jealous of any of the presidents. Anybody who gets this benefit, they got the best parking spaces, they get paid more, they get more vacation days, whatever the case may be. The princes are just kind of unhappy with what the presidents are able to experience and see, and the king gives them a lot of benefits and a lot of blessings. The satraps, or the princes, they hated Daniel because he was an alien and he was a Jew. And so this is what motivated a lot of the hate and anger that he had. Did I miss one? Yeah, I did. Sorry, I skipped right by it. Okay, let's go backwards. You guys just filled that one in. But what it shows is that for Daniel to serve under the king Darius, it demonstrates a believer doesn't have to compromise in order to succeed. Right? Because Daniel was very successful in the kingdom. Very successful. And as he was serving as this president under King Darius. By the way, do you think he agreed with King Darius and everything that he did? Oh, for one, he was a pagan, right? So he wouldn't have agreed with him there. Do you think that he agreed with, how he went about governing the land and so forth? No, but he still served, right? I think that's a good lesson for us as Christians to be able to say we can still be good servants, we can still be good leaders in a world that may not seek to follow Jesus. In fact, we find ourselves most of the time in roles like that. And we shouldn't avoid those things. We really shouldn't. Now, are there times that you're going to run headlong into, you have to do this, which is contrary to what your beliefs? That's when your employment should change. Right? I don't think you should ever compromise your values, those values being driven by the Word of God and by God's presence in your life. But I believe that you absolutely can still be. I was having a conversation with a lady just this last week that's a teacher in one of our public schools here in town. And she was talking about how she loves her students, shares that love with her students, comforts her students when they're in trouble. And I said, God is using you in ways that may not be being able to share the biblical background or reason why you love them. But you can still express that love and compassion and concern, and you should. We have a few officers that are in our congregation. I talk with them a lot about what's it like being a Christian and serving as a police officer or a sheriff's deputy or whatever the case may be. And they're like, well, sometimes really, really hard. And other times it's a way for me to take my faith and act it out in ways to be able to say, how can I be compassionate and loving and still serve? The problem is sometimes we think as Christians, the only way to work is to work in a church or a school or a mission and so forth. And you go, that's not at all what God calls us to do. What were his disciples? Fishermen, tax collector. By the way, Matthew, hated by most people. And Jesus goes, I want you to work for me. It's like, are you sure? Right? I don't know what Judas did, but he had a purpose as well. Okay? And all these things. They had regular blue-collar, some white-collar jobs. And God says, I'm going to use you. And he plans to use us. Same thing. All right. Matthew 6:33. Somebody have that? I don't want to skip over that. This is just an example of what I'm talking about.
But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you.
So we seek first his kingdom, right? That's the right thing. So if you think in your job, am I able to glorify God in my job? Do that first. Seek him. And if you seek him, he says everything else will fall into place. I don't mean perfectly in your way, right? Because you might say, oh, I'll never deal with any persecution in my job. No, you might, right? There'll be times where there's gossip and backstabbing and nitpicking in the job where you'll have to kind of go, I don't want any part of this. And that'll be hard socially in the job. Or you might be asked to do something by a boss or a manager or a supervisor that is unethical, and you're like, can't do it. Right? Can't do it because there's a value that actually supersedes what you say. Not to be obstinate necessarily, but it does mean that I can still seek him first and I can still be successful. I think one of the things I get from Daniel is that God did bless him. Joseph was another example in Egypt, right? And that's a godless pagan place. And yet God said, I'm going to bless you so that you elevate yourself way up until you are right-hand man to Pharaoh. And he was a Hebrew, right? Everybody else in Egypt is worshiping all the Egyptian gods except this one guy who is, the right hand to Pharaoh. And God said, I'm still blessing him, right? And I'm still blessing him by being a blessing to other people. All right. So Daniel, I said, was an alien and a Jew. That's one of the reasons that these princes hated him. Here's what I noticed. Satan has always hated God's people. I want you to think of the many ways that Christians, God's people, have been targeted by Satan. Think of the Holocaust. That was obviously, rolled by Satan. That wasn't just Hitler being a bad guy. It's moved by the evil and the chaos of Satan and tried to destroy God's people. That has been the case since the very beginning. People have often acted out against God's people. Today, between Muslims and Christians, in places where Muslims are moving across the land, in Africa and the Middle East and the Far East and things like that, that is still motivated by our enemy. Destroy God's people. See, because God's people become the lens through which his light shines into this world. So if I can hamper that, that's what Satan wants. I want to stop the light of Christ being able to be perceived through this. I think God's people are under attack even through this pandemic, through the election, through war and the hostility of terrorism and things like that. It's the same kinds of things. The church is under attack in various avenues. And all because Satan just wants us, as God's people, stop being a lens for the light. Get preoccupied by something, be distracted by something, believe something that's not true, take the easier path, you name it. It's all ways in which Satan is trying to defeat God's kingdom by attacking his people. Satan can't do anything to God. Can't hurt him, right? Not at all. He can't do anything to God. However, what Satan can do is he can attack God's favorites, right? His people, right? His church, all right? Okay, so from the deception to the decision, Daniel's decision. It was pretty clear what was going to happen, right? As these satraps came to the king and they leveraged some practices in the Persian and Mede Empire, that when the king passes an edict, nobody can go back on the edict, not even the king. I don't know why you'd make a rule like that and practice that. I think if I were the king, I'm like, the king gets to do what the king gets to do. But he says, now if you make this edict that at this point people have to bow down to you as king. We've learned historically, not the Bible, but historically in other accounts, what we call extra-biblical accounts, things outside the Bible, that King Darius loved to be flattered. When people would give gifts to him, they would receive a great deal of favor. That's kind of like most kings, politicians, and so forth. They like to have that heaped upon them. That's natural, fleshy, sinful kind of stuff. But when they come to him, they're like, "Oh, king, you are so great. People ought to worship you like a god. And so let's have that happen." He's like, "I like this idea. Let's pass an edict that everybody has to do it. I love this. Write it up. I'll sign it." And he does it, and then he does have a great deal of respect, Darius, for Daniel. Obviously, you're going to read it this week, if you do read it, chapter 6. It says that he actually intended that Daniel would one day rule Babylon, right? Because he said he is so good at this. Now, he was probably thinking he was going to expand the kingdom and so forth and just kind of go, who can I put in charge of all of Babylon? Daniel is really good, right? So he has a high regard for Daniel. Whether they're, friends relationally, I think he just thought he was a good guy and liked his leadership. Daniel, knowing what the consequence would be, he chose lions rather than miss one prayer time. I think of how my brain would work in that circumstance, right? Pray to the king, Darius, or be thrown into the lion's den. And then you think to yourself, I'm a really effective king. I can keep serving God by being this president. So what's the big deal of just one time bowing down and worshiping the king? I'll ask for forgiveness later. It's just one time. What's the big deal? Obviously for Daniel, he says, one time is one time too many. I don't worship anybody else other than God. And yet, he could justify it. You and I do the same thing. We do it often. Right? I'm going to watch this movie because I've heard that it's really good. I know it's not necessarily something that God would be glorified with, but I just really want to see it so I can talk about it at work and maybe help people see the badness of this movie, right? How inappropriate it is. Or I'm going to go to this concert with my son or my daughter because I want to do something with them even though I don't approve of anything that's going to happen at this concert or whatever. I mean, the list is long. And yet Daniel just simply says, listen, there's being torn to shreds by lions or praying to God. Right? And he goes, pray to God. And then so I have to accept that consequence. This wasn't just a timeout. This wasn't just going to go to prison and suffer for a while. This is like, if you worship God, you'll be killed. Period. Right? And the edict was there. I mean, he knew there was no way out of this. And he just simply says, I'm going to pray. And the satraps, the princes, they knew where he prayed up on his rooftop and so forth. They had spied him out. I mean, it was really pretty devious. And they went, aha, there he is. Right? So arrest him and so forth and hauls him down. And they let Darius know. And he's just kind of like, I'm so sorry, but that is the edict. I can't go back on this. I want to. Because I like Daniel and I recognize that this was a trick, but I can't go back on it. And so into the lion's den he goes. Philippians 4, would you please? Philippians 4, 6 and 7.
Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus.
I wonder what Daniel's prayer was that day. Right? It says, if you're anxious about anything, pray. Have you guys been anxious about anything? We've all been anxious. And not even about just the most natural things. Some of us have had different challenges in our life right now. We've had relationships go south. We've had health issues pop up. We've had job circumstances. We've had concerns and fears for our family members. We've got fears. We've got discouragement, and we worry about our future. I mean, there is anxiety galore. In fact, one of the things they're starting to report more and more now, and it's not surprising, is the mental illness effect of the last year. Right? And I'm not suggesting anything in the last year is false or anything else, not what I'm saying. But it has been a lot for people to wrap their heads around. Right? I mean, they're kind of like going, well, let's see, there was this election that went on that couldn't have been more tempestuous. All right? There is this pandemic, which is still fearful and frightful. There is jobs that have been lost and businesses that have gone under. I mean, there's just one thing after the other. There's just so much stress and strain. And so Paul here in Philippians, he says, listen, when there's anxiety, pray. And there's real help in prayer. And obviously, you know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. There was real help in prayer for Daniel. Right? I imagine he prayed and said, Lord, I am your representative. And if this means I'm going to get gobbled up by lions in the lion's den, then welcome me into your presence. But I want you to know, all things considered equal, I'd like to not be eaten by lions. Okay? And expresses that through prayer. All right, so we keep going down the bottom, right? Keep up with the D words. The king's disappointment, right? The disappointment that he had to follow through with his judgment upon Daniel, who he likes, thinks he's a good leader. He might have thought he was a good man. He might have had some admiration for him. I often wonder, and I can't identify with this. I've been a believer my whole life. I often wonder if these pagan places, all Babylon and Assyria and all these, the Canaanites and all of them, I wonder if they deep down had a great deal of doubt about their own gods. Right? I mean, I get why you worship them. I get that it's popular and the worship of them tends to be kind of raucous and very fleshy, your own sinful desires and so forth. But their gods just didn't come through. Right? They weren't consistent. They were really fickle because it was just random chance. Let's worship this God and hope that our crops come in. And then our crops don't come in very well. And we're like, all right, what do we need to do for that God to return, the goodness of what's going on? I don't feel good about it. I don't feel at peace about it. Some battles we win, some battles we lose. It doesn't seem to have much to do about our God, but we're going to keep worshiping him. I wonder if people like King Darius looked at Daniel's dedication to his God and the peace in his heart and said, I respect that. Right? There's something about your God and your relationship that's different than mine. And here's what here's what I mean by that. Right? God didn't want Darius to deliver Daniel. That should be capitalized there. The privilege belonged to God. God could have come to Darius, big hand right on the wall, don't throw Daniel into the lion's den. Right? And then Darius would have gone, okay. Right now, granted, it's still a message from God, but Darius would have made the distinction. He would have said, he is free to go. I trump the edict and so forth myself and whatnot, and I'm going to rescue Daniel. And God says, no, Darius isn't going to get the credit for this. I am. And because God needs the credit. Not because of his ego, but for us. Right? Now, I use an example of Gideon. You know that one story of Gideon where he's going to go to battle? And God says to Gideon, he says, you have too many men. He's like, what do you mean too many men? We're kind of matched up 1 for 1 against the enemy. He says, no, you have too many men. So here's what I want you to do. Gather the men together and go, who wants to go home and doesn't want to fight? And if they don't want to fight, let them go. No harm, no foul. And like 4/5 of them go home. And so Gideon's kind of looking around. There's crickets. He's like, so we're going to battle now. And the Lord says, nope, still have too many. What do you mean too many? We're going to get slaughtered. Okay? And he says, no, take them down to the river and have them drink. And whoever drinks on all fours and licks with their mouth, and then some guy's cup of water, I want you to separate those two groups, and this is the group that you go with. And so from having tens of thousands of men into battle, he ends up with 300. And God goes, now you're ready. I imagine Gideon's just kind of going, I did not sign up for this. Right? I mean, I've been rallying the guys around to fight and so forth. And they rout the enemy. And they do it really kind of in a cool way, and God helps them and so forth. But the whole point was God goes, I want the credit. Not for my ego's sake. God doesn't have an ego. Ego is ascending above what you are. He's God. He's got no place to go. Instead, he goes, I need you for your soul's sake to know that I am king. To know that I am God, that I am sovereign. And he's doing the same thing for Daniel. All right? So Daniel wasn't delivered from the lion's den. He wasn't diverted before he got there. This is not unlike Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going into the furnace. God didn't suddenly go, they swing open the doors and the furnace just goes, and it's out. Right? And God goes, I protected you. No, he protected them in the furnace. Right? He delivers Daniel out of the lion's den because he was in the lion's den. Sometimes God allows us to be in the midst of our suffering to actually deliver us, because the way that my brain works and the way that yours does, you'll justify why it didn't happen. Right? You'll say, oh, that was lucky. That was fortunate. That was fate. Right? All of which is bunk. Right? Instead, to be able to say, if God's going to rescue me from this, he says sometimes, I had somebody once tell me this, a good old country boy I was talking to way back in Michigan years and years ago. He says, sometimes the good Lord pulls the rug out from underneath you, lets you fall, but catches you before you hit the ground. He needs you to have that fear of falling so that you know he's your rescue. But not to simply kind of go, look, the rug's not going to get pulled out at all. Don't you feel safe and secure? Then I think you get cocky. Right? Then I think you feel self-confident, like, whoa, the world is easy as a Christian. He said, no. There's sometimes you're going to be in a car accident and you're going to scratch your head afterwards and kind of go, I don't know how I walked away from that. But he lets you go through the accident. Right? And sometimes he lets you lose a job and feel that discouragement and that fear in order to then pull you from that to be able to say, now I'm going to demonstrate my grace and my mercy and my love for you. We'll skip that psalm reading for now. Then there's the last one here, the deliverance. Right? The deliverance that happens for Daniel from the lion's den and the beauty that is. I want you to, for a minute, just think, if you haven't read the story, you should know this. Contrast the nights of both King Darius and Daniel. It doesn't tell us a lot about it. It tells us a lot about Darius. He had a sleepless night, terrified, worried for his man Daniel and how awful he felt about having to throw him in the lion's den, and the controversy in his own mind going, but I'm king, I shouldn't have to force this, but if I'm going to be looked at and respected by my people, I got to follow through with the edict, but I just threw my best president into the lion's den and he's gone. Right? And how restless his sleep was. I imagine Daniel slept like a baby. Right? Now, I don't know that for sure. That's not biblical. But what I do believe, even if he was up and awake, I don't think he had the same restlessness that Darius did. It says that an angel closed the mouth of the lions. I don't know if the angel was with him. I don't know if he was aware of it or whether he just said, I'm sure that's what took place because I'm still alive and the lions didn't eat me and so forth. But I believe that Daniel, in his faith, right, rested very easily in the midst of lions. I've had people question me, and I imagine you've had some of that too, during this pandemic, during the election, during financial crisis, all of these reasons to be anxious, and said, how do you feel, right? How do you face this? And I hope that we can respond much more like Daniel than Darius. Darius thought, I'm in control, right? And this sense of, uncontrol over Daniel and the lions and so forth filled him with a great deal of anxiety and instability. He just felt very unsettled, very unsettled. And yet Daniel, he wasn't, right? He wasn't feeling as though, what am I going to do? What do I can do? How can I stop the lions? And so forth. He just prayed and trusted. Kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego told Nebuchadnezzar, hey, listen, you can toss us in that furnace, and we may die. And if we do, we go to be with God. Or God can rescue us from the furnace. Either way, King, we're not bowing down. This is the line that we take. Guys, I hope in the midst of this time, and in 10 years from now, we still choose Daniel's path. No matter what is happening in the world around us, that we can rest a bit more securely. I know my flesh gets in the way like it does for you, but to be able to, Lord, I want to trust that through this, you're with me. Here.
This story, not a lot unlike, as much gut-wrenching as it was for me, but the little girl in the school shooting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Same thing.
Yeah. You talking about that one in the Amish community?
No,
Colorado.
Oh, yeah, that Cassie Bernal that I referenced before. Yeah, that idea of when she was held up by the gunman, and the story goes, she was asked, do you believe in Jesus? And believing that if she says yes, her life is going to be over.
And you pray she was at peace when she said that, a lot like not being arrested.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Today, we face many temptations to compromise our faith. Many compromises. Right? I think that there's a great deal of temptation for us. Like I said, I'll just do it this once, and then I'll ask for forgiveness. Or it's not that big a deal, or nobody knows what's going on in my heart. I can secretly say, I'm not going to depend on the Lord. I'm going to take this one out and do it myself. I think many times we do that in life. We say, Lord, I've got this one. I don't need to ask you. I don't need to consult you. I've got this. And that's when God kind of goes, this is going to get a little rough. So that's the last thing I want you to believe, is that you can direct this, because I'm your father. I love you, and I want the best for you. It's kind of like if my kids, they're older now, but when they were teenagers and had cars and stuff, if they said, well, listen, the curfew is 10. I'm pretty sure it'd be fine if I was 10:30. I've decided, right? You realize they'd kind of run headlong into the boss at that point. And if Kristen needed any help, then I would come in. You can tell her that I said that. Receive that. She would disagree. Right?
Amen.
Does she watch the back half of these?
What's that?
Does she go back and watch the back half of these?
Yeah. I hope not. All right. The last one, destruction. Right? The destruction. The things that happen. Because afterwards, the king, when he comes to Daniel in the morning, and he's just... He comes because there's something in Darius that says, I hope. I hope your God could protect you. There's something about what he has seen in Daniel that gives him some sense. He doesn't stay away from the lion's den because he's like, I don't even want to be reminded of what happened to my man Daniel. And I don't want to go near it. Instead, he comes there with a sense of maybe. Right? Daniel's dedication to his God seemed to be more passionate than ours to our fake gods and so forth. Now, he didn't know they were fake, but just the difference of commitment and dedication. Maybe he thought it was possible. And when he comes and finds that he's still there and he's just fine, and he says, oh, king, I'm good. And he goes, bring him out of there. Because the punishment was to throw him in, not leave him there. And clearly nothing's going to happen, so get him out of there. And then the king kind of recognizes the power of Daniel's God, and in order to make sure this doesn't happen again, he takes those that have framed him and he tosses them in. And he doesn't only toss them in, but he tosses in their wives and their children as well. Now we see that and go, ouch. But see, the judgment of God upon people, we have to understand that you and I, we have responsibilities for the people around us. Right? You have a responsibility to your families. You have a responsibility to your spouses. Right? We have those responsibilities. We don't just simply go, hey, it's none of my business what they believe. None of my business is what they claim. Instead, God says, no, listen, I put you on this planet, put you in the family, put you in the neighborhood, in the church where you are, on purpose to be lights to this world. Why did God permit Daniel to suffer? I've often said this before, to make God famous. Right? In the midst of the suffering, I allowed this so that God would get the glory. Church, I pray that through the challenges that we face now, with how we talk about fear, how we talk about anxiety, how we talk about discouragement, how we talk about depression, how we talk about anger, and things like that, of all the things that kind of those emotions that come out of what you and I are dealing with. I pray that your example, I pray my example as a Christian, points to God's glory. And sometimes it's hard to see that, to be able to go, I don't know how God's going to use this, I just believe that He will, because He says so. I've had people tell me, Pastor, I don't know how anything good can come out of this. And I'm like, well, unless you're God, you don't know what He knows. No, and I say that lovingly, right? I mean, if somebody goes, I can't imagine how anything good can come out of this. I just say, okay, right? I don't know either. God hasn't told us that. But what I do believe is God said He'll work all things out for good for those that love Him. And His definition of good is not always my definition. My definition of good is peace and easy and comfortable. And yet when you read His Word, He's like, that's not mine. My job is so that I get the glory, so that more people know about me through you. All right, let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the impact that you intend to have through your church into this world. Lord, use us in mighty ways, in important ways. And Lord, I pray for us in consistent ways. Lord, use us, I pray, as your representatives. Let us be the Daniels and Esthers in this world, that we would be lenses for your light of love and forgiveness and truth. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. God bless you guys. Have a great week.
So what do you think if he went back?